The desert was never meant to know rain. Yet tonight the sky tore open and poured rage onto the earth as if trying to drown the world. Caleb Rohr sat beside the small stove in his isolated cabin, watching the flames tremble with each gust of wind. He had lived alone for 2 years, wrapped in the silence he believed he had earned. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Caleb froze. No one ever came this far into the borderlands, not in daylight, and certainly not during a storm that could peel the roof off a barn. A second set of knocks followed. The same rhythm, measured, intentional. His heartbeat tightened as he reached the door and unlatched it. 4 women stood outside, drenched to the bone. Their clothes clung to their bodies, weighted with mud and cold, and their eyes shone under the lantern light like wild creatures cornered by fate. The tallest of them stepped forward, black hair dripping down her shoulders as she met Caleb's gaze. "We need shelter," she said. Her voice held no tremble, only exhaustion sharpened into steel. "Men are chasing us. They will not stop until they find us." Behind her, the youngest, barely 18, leaned heavily on another sister, her right arm wrapped in fabric soaked with blood. The girl's face was pale, and her breaths came to shallow. Caleb's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't be out here," he said quietly. "We don't have a choice," the eldest replied. "Let us stay for the night, please." A distant echo of hooves rolled across the storm like a warning drum. Whoever hunted them was close to close. Caleb looked at the sky, then at the empty land stretching endlessly behind them. Out here, a person could disappear without ever being found. He had come to these wastelands for exactly that reason. He knew that opening his door meant opening the door to questions about them, questions about him, and questions the world had no right to ask. But the youngest sister's knees suddenly buckled, and the eldest caught her just in time. That was all it took. Caleb stepped aside and opened the door fully. "Get inside." The women hurried in, bringing with them the scent of rain, blood, and desert grit. Water pooled on the wooden floor as they stood in the small room, shivering from the cold but too tense to relax. Caleb shut the door against the storm and turned toward them. "Let me see her arm," he said, nodding toward the youngest. The eldest hesitated, exchanging looks with her sisters. Suspicion flickered in their eyes, suspicion born from betrayal that must have followed them for days, maybe years. But finally, she nodded. And that was the moment Caleb realized this was not an ordinary night, and these were not ordinary women. Caleb eased the youngest sister into the wooden chair near the lantern, where the trembling light exposed the full brutality of her wound. Her arm was torn open in a long, uneven gash, the flesh bruised and ragged, as though something had ripped at her rather than cut her. And the sight made Caleb's jaw tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. The eldest sister hovered protectively at her side, her posture rigid, like a wolf ready to bite even when cornered, while the other 2 scanned the cabin with restless eyes that spoke of nights filled with running, hiding, and expecting death at every turn. Outside, the storm thrashed against the cabin walls, wind howling through the cracks like a wounded animal. And underneath that chaotic roar, Caleb could still pick out the steady, rhythmic thrum of hooves moving somewhere in the distance. Too consistent to be thunder, too many to be an accident. He gathered his old medical kittits, edges worn from a different life, and knelt beside the girl. his hands surprisingly steady as he cleaned the wound with alcohol that made her shiver but not cry, proving she had already endured far worse than this moment. Her sisters watched every movement of his hands, ready to intervene. And for the first time, Caleb realized these women were not simply victims, running from monsters. They were survivors, shaped by them. As he wrapped the bandage, the eldest finally broke the silence, her voice low and controlled, telling him they had escaped from a group of men who owned land, weapons, and influence stretching across half the borderland. Men who used fear as casually as others used greetings. Men who believed the sisters belonged to them by right. They had stolen food at night, slept in dry riverbeds, and moved through abandoned mining sites like ghosts. Every step fueled by the knowledge that if they were caught, they would not live to see another sunrise, or worse, they would live and never be free again. Caleb felt a familiar coldness settle in his chest, a soldier's instinct he had buried beneath years of silence and solitude. But danger had a way of calling old instincts back from the dead, before he could ask the questions forming in his mind. A soft scraping noise brushed against the outside wall of the cabin, too gentle, too precise, too deliberate to be the wind. And in an instant all four sisters froze where they stood, their chests rising in shallow, panicked breaths as the lantern flame flickered like it sensed the presence too. Caleb slowly rose to his feet, his eyes never leaving the wall, and reached up toward the rifle mounted above the weapon he had promised himself he would never use again. Yet tonight, as the storm raged and something moved outside in the shadows, he realized that whatever he had been running from no longer mattered, because danger had arrived at his doorstep and he was no longer alone to face it. The scraping at the wall came again, slow, careful, and deliberate, like fingertips brushing the wood to test how strong the cabin really was. And Caleb felt the air tighten as if the whole room inhaled and refused to exhale. He stepped forward with the rifle held low but ready, while the eldest sister pulled the younger girls behind her, their eyes fixed on the door, as though expecting it to burst inward at any moment. The storm outside screamed against the roof, but beneath its roar, Caleb heard something far more chilling: soft footsteps sinking into wet sand, the metallic jingle of reins, and the creak of saddle leather shifting under weight. All of it too controlled to belong to thieves or wanderers. It was the sound of trained men moving with intention. He signaled the women to stay silent and moved to the window, lifting the curtain just enough to glimpse through the rain. And what he saw sent a cold shiver crawling up his spine. 3 riders stood only yards from the cabin, their silhouettes barely visible through the sheets of water. But their stillness and posture screamed danger, as if they were waiting for permission to strike. One of them raised a lantern, casting a dim glow over his face, and Caleb recognized the expression instantly. It was the hardened, calculating stare of a man who believed the world owed him obedience, and anything less was a challenge he was eager to crush. The eldest sister whispered that his name was Harrow, leader of the men who had claimed them, a man known in the borderlands for inflicting nightmares that outlived their victims. And Caleb suddenly understood why the sisters looked the way they did, tired, wounded, but fiercely protective of one another, because they had survived a monster who hunted with patience and cruelty rather than noise. Harrow stepped closer to the cabin, his voice carrying through the storm as he called out, "We know you're in there. This doesn't have to be difficult." And his calmness was more terrifying than any threat shouted in anger. Caleb felt the women tense behind him, the youngest clutching the bandaged arm against her chest, her breath quick and shaky, while the eldest grit her teeth as if preparing for the nightmare to begin again. Caleb's mind raced. He did not want a fight, but he knew these men were not here to negotiate, and if he opened the door, the sisters would be dragged away screaming while he was left bleeding on the floor. He steadied his breathing, aware of how every choice he made tonight would change everything he had built in his isolation. But the thought of doing nothing, of letting 4 desperate women be recaptured, set something, old and dangerous, burning inside him. He moved away from the window, loaded a bullet into the chamber with a quiet, deadly click, and whispered for the women to stay low, because the moment Harrow's shadow shifted toward the door, Caleb knew the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm about to break inside. The cabin door shuddered under the first heavy push, splinters cracking as Harrow's men forced their way in, the storm outside pounding against the walls like a drum of fate. And Caleb reacted before the noise fully registered, dragging the youngest sister behind the table as the eldest threw herself in front of the others, eyes blazing with controlled fury, while the 2 middle sisters froze for a heartbeat, calculating, waiting for a chance to act. The men spilled in, revolvers drawn, faces slick with rain and malice, and Caleb raised his rifle, hands steady despite the roar of adrenaline, knowing that one misstep could mean death for all of them, or worse, the girls being dragged back into captivity, screaming and broken. Harrow himself entered last, massive and imposing, wet coat clinging to broad shoulders, revolver leveled with unnerving calm, and a grin that promised cruelty stretched across his face as he scanned the room, immediately noticing the displaced footprints, the wet patches from the women's arrival, the small signs of life that meant someone had been hiding them. He spoke slowly, deliberately, his voice carrying over the storm. "Looks like you've been busy, Roar." And the words hit like a blade, reopening memories Caleb had tried to lock away, the raids, the orders he had defied, the innocence he could not save. Caleb's gaze flicked between the sisters and the intruders, measuring, calculating. He had seconds to act, to protect them, and he knew his only advantage was speed and the knowledge of every shadow, every plank, every inch of this small cabin. The youngest whimpered, clutching her bandaged arm, and Caleb whispered for her to stay calm, even as Harrow moved closer, testing the air. And one of his men reached toward the bedboards, where Caleb had hidden a second weapon, a hunting knife that had saved him before and might do so again. Tension coiled in the room like a living thing, the storm outside fading into background noise as all eyes fixed on each other, predator and prey, blurred by desperation, fear, and determination. Caleb remembered the lessons of the cavalry, the quick decisions, the reflexes honed by years of war. And as Harrow leaned in, a miscalculated reach toward the girls, Caleb made his move swift, precise, driving the knife upward beneath the attacker's rib, a single strike that dropped him to the floor with a wet choke. And before the others could react, Caleb spun, caught the rifle, and leveled it at the remaining men, the sisters staring wide-eyed, their fear mixed with the faint glimmer of hope. as the storm outside no longer seemed as threatening as the chaos he had just unleashed. Knowing that this night had shifted everything, there was no turning back, only forward, and they would either survive together or not at all. The cabin erupted into chaos as the remaining intruders scrambled for their weapons. But Caleb moved like a shadow, adrenaline sharpening every sense. Grabbing the sisters' hands and pulling them toward the hidden root cellar beneath the floorboards, their wet clothes sticking to them, arms trembling, hearts pounding in unison with the storm outside. The youngest cried softly, fear and pain blending into a fragile rhythm, while the eldest maintained a taut composure, guiding her sisters as they descended the narrow wooden stairs. Caleb following last, rifle poised, every step calculated to avoid alerting the remaining men, whose shouts echoed above and outside, mingling with the howl of wind and the hammering rain. Once inside, the air was thick, damp, and musty, but it offered a brief sanctuary, and Caleb quickly checked each sister, seeing the exhaustion etched into their faces, their breaths ragged yet steadying as they realized they had evaded the immediate danger. Outside, the storm tore through the desert, turning the landscape into a slippery maze of mud and rock. But Caleb's mind raced faster than the rain, tracking where Harrow's men might split to search, anticipating their moves with the precision of a cavalry officer who had spent years predicting enemy tactics. And he realized the only way to ensure the sisters' survival was not to hide forever, but to move, to create distance while using the storm as cover. The eldest whispered questions about the men, the night, the path forward, but Caleb shook his head, signaling silence, then produced a few supplies he had hidden in the corner, sharing them quickly: a flask of water, some dry cloth to stanch bleeding, a crude map marking the nearest safe routes through the borderland. And he made sure each sister understood their role if the men broke through, which seemed inevitable. Minutes passed, or hours, time meaningless beneath the pounding rain and the threat of pursuit, until finally the sounds outside faded, replaced by cautious footsteps and the occasional distant shout, signaling that Harrow's men were regrouping, searching for something they could not see, unaware that the women they hunted were mere feet below them, alive and determined. Caleb's thoughts turned to escape routes, to the ridges and ravines nearby, to the lessons of survival he had once taught himself in other storms. And he made the decision they would leave, now while the night was their ally, while the storm masked their scent and their movement, and while the sisters, exhausted but unbroken, still trusted him enough to follow blindly. As they climbed the narrow stairs, one by one, Caleb's hands steadied theirs, his eyes scanning the broken windows, the wet floors, every potential threat, until they reached the threshold, emerging into the sheets of rain. The desert night, slick and treacherous, mud sucking at their boots, wind tearing at their clothes. But freedom smelled sweet, sharp, and urgent. Together, they moved into the storm, silent but purposeful, weaving through the dark landscape, Caleb leading, the sisters close, hearts racing, muscles aching, the roar of rain mingling with the distant calls of predators, both human and wild. And in that relentless night, each step forward became a testament to survival, defiance, and the unspoken promise that they would not let fear dictate their fate again. The first light of dawn barely pierced the horizon when Caleb and the sisters finally paused on a rocky ridge. Drenched, muddy, and exhausted, the storm behind them fading into distant rumble, leaving a fragile silence that felt almost sacred after the night's relentless chaos. The sisters huddled close, shivering not just from cold, but from adrenaline and relief. Their faces streaked with rain, blood, yet their eyes burned with something stronger than fear survivors' fire. And Caleb took a moment to let them catch their breath, scanning the terrain ahead, calculating routes that would take them to safety while avoiding patrols, trading paths, and natural hazards, knowing that each step forward was as dangerous as the last, but now guided by purpose instead of desperation. Ayanna, the eldest, finally spoke, her voice low but steady, asking what would become of Harrow and the men who had hunted them. And Caleb shook his head, his expression grim, knowing that justice might not come swiftly, but his focus remained on the sisters' survival, on ensuring that their future was no longer dictated by the whims of men who saw them as property. They moved on, slipping through ravines, scaling low ridges, and wading through shallow streams, Caleb at the front, rifle ready, while the sisters followed silently, each step a mix of exhaustion and fierce resolve. And he noted how they had learned quickly, how their instincts had sharpened, how even fear had become a tool they could wield, a shield as much as a warning. The desert slowly gave way to scrubland, faint trails of movement, the possibility of allies, of neutral eyes who would not betray the man. Caleb realized that they were no longer running blindly, but moving toward a life reclaimed. As the sun rose higher, he spoke softly to Ayanna, acknowledging her leadership and bravery, and for the first time since the storm began, she allowed herself a brief, weary smile, the kind that carried both gratitude and the unspoken knowledge of all they had endured. And she gently took his hand for a moment, a gesture of trust and connection rather than necessity. And Caleb felt the isolation of 2 years peel away in the warmth of that fleeting human contact. Hours later, they emerged onto a dirt road leading toward the territorial marshal's office, a place that promised law, accountability, and perhaps closure. And Caleb knew that the fight was not over, that Harrow and his men might still wield power, but he also knew that the sisters were no longer helpless, that they had learned to act, to survive, to resist, and to reclaim their agency. When they finally arrived, exhausted, soaked, and dirty, the doors of the marshal's office swung open to reveal authority willing to listen. And Caleb recounted the horrors, the escapes, the threats, and the resilience of 4 young women who had been treated as property yet refused to remain victims. And the marshal, skeptical at first, eventually acknowledged the gravity, the courage, and the evidence. As chains were placed on Harrow and his remaining men, the sisters stood tall beside Caleb, their heads held high, the morning sun catching their faces in a way that illuminated strength, survival, and dignity. And Caleb, for the first time in years, felt the weight of his own past lift slightly, replaced by the knowledge that he had chosen action over fear, that the rain and darkness of the previous nights had given way to light, and that sometimes doing the right thing demanded facing storms both outside and within, but that in doing so, lives could be saved, freedom reclaimed, and the world just a little set right.